to a record. Perfect. So it's about 2 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Alicia Lopez. I'm the director of the Southeast Florida Clean Cities Coalition, and I am currently the acting director of the Central Florida Clean Cities Coalition. Next, I would like to introduce Alexander from Tampa.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Alex Kolpakov. I'm the director of the Tampa Bay Clean Cities Coalition in Tampa Bay. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And then the next person I would like to introduce would be Andy. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, give us a little bit of background on yourself.
Yeah, I'm Andy Burnham. I work at Argonne National Lab. I've been supporting the Clean Cities program for about 20 years now, and my work has been in looking at the environmental impacts of different transportation technologies. So we've done a lot of comparisons of powertrains to understand what the emissions, environmental impacts are of, switching from gasoline and diesel to something else, whether it's electric, biofuels, gaseous fuels. And then we've done a lot of work in cost analysis as well. So doing total cost of ownership. And so happy to kind of walk through some of the tools with you. And, I know we have a small group, so it can be informal. Like I have some slides, but don't need to like PowerPoint you to death. So if there are specific things you want to talk about, happy to go through them or like just walk through. So.
No, that's honestly perfect, Andy. And that's actually leads me right into kind of my next point. I did make this training a little bit smaller and a little bit more intimate because I really wanted our stakeholders to ask questions. If they're using the tool, maybe what kind of issues they've had, or if they're thinking about using AFLEET, kind of what would be the best steps to kind of take when using it. So with that, I want to go ahead and pass it over to Andy, but please, everyone on this call, please feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you have questions, or if you want to raise your hand, you can use the chat as well. We'll definitely be monitoring that as well. But I really want this to be an informal, just really open. Like I said, we have Andy here, who developed this tool. So I really want you guys to ask all those burning questions when you guys are using the tool. So that way we can, help you with whatever we can. And with that, Andy, please feel free to take away the show. You're on mute, Andy.
Yep, I'll share my screen in 1 second.
No worries.
So I guess the thing that I like to highlight is that we've worked in this space for a long time, that we've really tried to analyze different powertrains and technologies over the last 20 years, and like kind of as technologies change, as the political winds change, we have tried to cover like all the bases so that our tools don't focus on maybe one technology solely, and just because like the portfolio of Clean Cities covers a wide range of fuels, and while certain things may be important today, like we don't want to like discount things that are not like maybe being pushed as much, but that are still important to fleets and Clean City stakeholders who are interested in like kind of the different potential benefits of these fuels. And so there is no necessarily magic bullet, there's magic buckshot. And so depending on like what your goals are, it really matters like which fuel, like, that helps you kind of determine which fuel may or may not work for you. And so we cover kind of the environmental footprint with the costs. But there are other things like operational challenges, which are of course really important, or like, we touch on infrastructure costs, but like some of those things, we don't necessarily have a tool that like is a magic bullet in itself that will answer all your questions, but it is an unbiased source to give you emissions data, as well as a resource to help kind of do some cost analysis. Costs is really dependent on assumptions that you make, or like data that you have for your scenario, whether there's tax incentives and all kinds of things. But we try to provide a platform for folks to do kind of this kind of comparisons. So if there are, like, again, as Alicia said, like questions, feel free. I probably won't be looking at the chat, but if you want to like stop, me in the middle of the presentation, and ask a question, feel free. I will share my screen now, and hopefully, so I have two presentations open. Hopefully this is the right one. Let me get this open.
No worries, Andy.
Okay.
I feel like it's always like that.
Yeah. So I'm going to give it a little introduction, talk about some new features. I think I have one extra demo. So like both of the Excel and then the online. So we'll go through kind of that. And I think someone may have some questions about our AFLEET CFI tool, the charging fueling infrastructure tool. So we can show that as well and kind of talk about that. So the AFLEET is kind of centered around, I've talked a lot about this already, like what your footprint is, what the costs are. We have other metrics that we look at, and more specific environmental footprint is generic. What specific environmental metrics you're interested is, can get into whether, we're focusing more on petroleum use, maybe 10, 15 years ago, but, air pollution, carbon footprint are crucially important still today, and cost of ownership. And we look at not only kind of new vehicles, like kind of this new purchase of with alternative fuels, but like, here's your existing fleet. Can we footprint it to understand where your emissions are today? So the tool was developed about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. The first version was released, and it was for clean city stakeholders, so fleet managers, decision makers who wanted to look at cost and emissions analyses. We cover not just light duty and heavy duty vehicles, which we originally started with, but we've added off-road equipment as well. The four metrics I mentioned: petroleum use, greenhouse gas, air pollutant emissions, and cost of ownership, are the kind of the key outputs of what we're typically generating. And I mentioned this, that we cover a wide range of fuel technologies, that we want to be able to look at the baseline gasoline or diesel, but then also look at hybrids and plug-in electrics, which could be like EVs, or fuel cell vehicles can sometimes be plug-in electrics, and then alternative fuels. So I mentioned gaseous fuels like CNG and propane, hydrogen, then biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel. And then for like some of these, the where these fuels come from matter to their environmental footprint or even their costs. So for like CNG, if it's renewable natural gas, your environmental footprint is different than it is if it's fossil natural gas. And so we have data that covers that as well. We update the tool each year with kind of new data. So we're kind of always doing kind of cost and emissions updates. And then we try to add new features too. So we get questions from clean cities, coalitions and stakeholders about like, hey, what about this? And so we try to create a calculator or tool that will help, answer what about that, like, so can we help, answer questions that you have today. And if you have some question that the tool doesn't necessarily answer, or you think it like kind of in the vein, like, hey, what about this? We always appreciate that type of feedback, because that's how we make, the tool more useful. So, after today, you start playing with AFLEET more, and you say, hey, it'd be really nice if it did this, maybe we can do it, maybe we can't, but it's that feedback is valuable. There's quite a number of tools in our kind of AFLEET toolbox. I'm even missing one here: the AFLEET spreadsheet, the online tool. We have the heavy duty vehicle emissions calculator, the HDVEC. A-Travel is kind of a corollary tool. And then the AFLEET CFI is the one that's missing, which we released earlier in the spring, which was focused really on the discretionary grant funding from FHWA. But and I can talk about it a little bit too. So the spreadsheet was kind of the thing I released in 2013. It was the first thing that we put out there, and it started with kind of 3 kind of features. One is a simple payback calculator, and that's for fleet managers who want to do a relatively like quick analysis with kind of focusing on a couple of key metrics and a couple of key data points, I should say. So a simple payback is really the incremental cost between an alternative and a conventional vehicle, and you divide that by the potential annual operating savings to get the amount of years or time it's going to take to pay back that incremental cost. We've added off-road. It started with just on-road, but we added off-road. You're able to look at light duty, heavy duty. For off-road, it's small equipment, large equipment as well. It's not just a cost calculator, it does annual emissions as well. So you can get that data for your emissions footprint of the kind of new versus the new conventional vehicle versus a new alternative vehicle. Also, the total cost of ownership was, original tool. A little more detailed, gets into kind of net present value and the time value of money. The inputs aren't actually that much different than the simple payback calculator, just a little more detailed in kind of the cost analysis. But again, it also includes emissions and looks at kind of the lifetime or your suggested like ownership period of like the vehicle, not just kind of an annual simple payback approach. Idle reduction calculator, maybe coming more into interest, like some coalitions work on idle reduction, some don't. We haven't spent as much time in that space, but it is something that we've heard just recently, like some more interest in getting back and doing more idle reduction analysis. The other calculator that I mentioned that was originally there was the fleet footprint. So this is basically to do an emissions footprint of your existing fleet. So entering potentially line by line, equipment by equipment or vehicle by vehicle, the miles that it drives, the fuel that it uses, and then kind of the age of the vehicle to get that footprint. Not everybody wants to do that, but it is sometimes a good practice in helping understand kind of where you are with your equipment, especially when you have like heterogeneous, you have like a lot of different types of vehicles and equipment. This can be a good way to help you figure out for the kind of doing a payback or cost of ownership is like, well, I want to focus in on, these couple of vehicle types at first. And then last are kind of 3 new calculators, 3 newish calculators that we just updated and released this year. The EV utility rate calculator, and I'll talk about each of these, so I won't go into too much depth, but this is basically being able to calculate the cost of electricity for charging. So things like demand charges for your rate, because each rate is maybe complicated. Not all rates are complicated, but there might be some time of use element. As I mentioned, a demand charge that depends on the time of use. Like all those things can, seasonal impacts will impact kind of the cost of charging. The EV charging cost calculator. So this is kind of taking not just the utility costs, it includes that, but also the cost of installing, purchasing a charger, and then kind of any annual running cost of like operating the charger. So kind of a total cost of charging calculator where you amortize everything into like one value. And then the charging and fueling infrastructure calculator. This was previously just the EV kind of infrastructure calculator where specifically like the VW grants way back when had like some component to say like, if you install EV charger, what are the emissions benefits? And this is, it's always a weird question to me because like the emissions come from using the vehicles and the infrastructure is like the pathway to like get those vehicles to run. But how we came up with an approach, which we've actually worked on this, even longer, but like basically how much fuel do you dispense? You can estimate how many miles the vehicle runs based on that fuel, then say like, well, if that was actually using gasoline and it was driving the same amount of miles, what would the footprint of that kind of baseline or like counterfactual, like if it was gasoline, what would it be? And then know that I'm pumping biodiesel. So the biodiesel emissions of that, 1,000 gallons that I dispense, represent X amount of emissions, and then do a comparison. So we kind of rebranded it charging and fueling infrastructure because of the CFI program, the FHWA discretionary grant funding that came out. So we expanded beyond EV charging to all the fuels that in our kind of toolbox or that we look at. Yeah. And yeah, so that's the spreadsheet. I know that Alicia mentioned this, and I know that like the spreadsheet can be a bit overwhelming because there is, 8 calculators, and it's not so like step by step to use it. But there's, the data's there, and if you're like interested in like the underlying guts of the calculations or where the information is or pieces of the information, like you can go and look for it if you get comfortable with that. But we understand that like that's not for everybody, and so we developed kind of AFLEET Online, so developing a more user-friendly interface for people to do these types of calculations. So we just released 2 new calculators. We had a simple payback on-road for the past about 5-6 years, but just this year we added a simple payback off-road calculator and the total cost of ownership calculator. And then we're working on the development of the EV utility rate calculator. We have a version that's almost ready for like review, kind of internal review. If anybody's interested in doing external review, we can do it. It can be a little, yeah, if anybody's interested, please ping me. And then after we finish the utility rate calculator, we'll move on to the charging cost calculator. I'll walk through the online versions as well as the spreadsheet a little bit later. We have the heavy duty vehicle emissions calculator. I'll go through this relatively quickly. But basically this was, as I mentioned, like the VW grants were one of the kind of big push for like people getting kind of doing emissions analysis. So we developed this specifically for that. It does have some other capabilities that like aren't really, it's not like VW specific. You can do comparisons, but it's meant for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and it has a limited number of vehicle technologies. Primarily the reason was just like looking at NOx benefits. So we don't have biofuels because there wasn't any NOx benefits for those vehicles. If anybody has more questions about this, I'll happy to talk about it. I don't think I have a slide on the AFLEET CFI in this deck, but I have the tool available and can walk through it
I was going to
shortly.
say, yeah, if you want, yeah, I was going to say, if you just want to show it, that would be okay. Since you don't have a slide, we're okay with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. So I think I didn't open it. So I'll open up the AFLEET CFI. I think I'm sharing my entire screen, so this should just take a second to load up.
No worries. I was going to say, yeah, we just see your like the Excel spreadsheet now opening up.
Okay.
So no worries.
Yep. So the AFLEET CFI kind of has this intro sheet. It's relatively simple because it was meant for, doing a grant program, and they didn't want all the kind of knobs and I guess the things to kind of tweak your assumptions. It was meant to be as simple as possible. So we have, like in the spreadsheet, we have an intro page, and it kind of walks you through, step 1, step 2, step 3, a little bit of like the optional things that you have to do. But the tool is really meant to estimate kind of the emissions footprint of utilizing these types of chargers or stations. And what it really boils down to is how much are these being utilized. So the styling's a little bit different. We basically copied and included a lot of this capabilities in the full AFLEET spreadsheet, but this is meant to be just a little bit simpler, and it has less fuels. It doesn't have the biofuels. But basically, it allows you to enter, certain amount of chargers. So that's a question we get a lot. Is it like ports or is it chargers? we say EVSEs, like the actual EVSE. It might have 2 or more ports on it, but it's just one EVSE. And then the utilization. So we use like national average information, or kind of as best we can for certain stations, for kind of the average. And then sometimes we had actually good data on low and high. Some we just kind of had to make some assumptions for the low and high, especially for like CNG and LNG. But anyway, like you can tweak these things. These are assumptions you could tweak and say like we have expectations to dispense more fuel, and then basically tweak where's the fuel coming from? Is it North American fossil natural gas? Is it renewable natural gas? Where's the electricity coming from? And if I just pick a couple pieces of equipment, like it generates the results very quickly. Like it's all here in like 1 to 2, a couple of steps to get your output. And that was again for the grant. The spreadsheet, for AFLEET is again more detailed than like you can get into this. So if anybody has questions about like, well, how do you do the utilization and like, and that can be tricky if you don't have information like from existing chargers in your area. We tried to give some sense of like, well, how many chargers or how many, vehicles like would our default information like fill. So you could kind of say, well, like the average light duty vehicle, let's say it has a 60 kilowatt hour battery pack, and then we're simplifying, like typically people don't run on at almost zero and come and charge all the way to full, but for the purposes of this, like 60 kilowatt hours, our moderate assumption would cover 100 vehicles or something like that. So there are ways to kind of like do this step by step and say like, yeah, we're going to fill X amount of vehicles per week or per day or something, and come up with numbers like that. If you have questions, I can help. So back to the slides. So I think this is maybe hopefully like the last of like the background is the data sources. So we just our team here is researchers. We do a lot of work for the Department of Energy, like to make kind of research and development decisions, like what should be funded, what are the pathways if we want to like focus on, say, a metric of decarbonization, like what technologies, what fuels make sense. But we, the work that I do oftentimes is more public facing, and like we don't want to get into like all the details that our R&D team does. So we take a lot of the information from our research team, which ends up going into like the Argonne GREET model, which covers like a lot of the types of analysis we do, which is called life cycle analysis. And this chart kind of shows that we're not just focused on like the emissions of a vehicle out its tailpipe, but like all the steps needed to produce the fuel. Or we get questions about like, well, what about building the vehicle? What about the battery for an electric vehicle? So we have a team of 30 or so researchers who cover different aspects of this, both fuel cycle, the fuel production, and then the vehicle cycle, the vehicle production, to answer questions, or do it, I don't say answer questions, but like be able to answer kind of key research questions that we have in this space on electric vehicles or fuel cells or biofuels or whatever it might be. But I take a lot of that information, put it into AFLEET so that we have kind of the best, publicly available, like non-biased information for emissions in our tools, so that it's available for you. And I get a lot of questions about like, hey, can I take this data and do stuff with it? And like, yeah, that's what the spreadsheet allows for, that you can go in there and kind of grab some of that information, and if you want to kind of do your own calculation, it's there. We also use emissions data from the EPA MOVES model, which helps give us kind of like the tailpipe out emissions. that helps us do like gasoline and diesel state by state emission factors. But then we do a lot of work for biofuels to compare like what the difference between a biofuel vehicle versus a diesel vehicle is. Let's say. We use the Clean Cities Alternative Fuel Price Report for fuel prices. We get behind because like we update the tool once a year and fuel prices change every day, or not every day, but kind of like that every week, let's say. And there are seasonal variations of fuel, and we might be able to project roughly like, hey, costs are expected to increase 2% for gasoline or diesel next year, but predicting the future for fuel prices is impossible and fraught. And as fleet managers, knowing well that like volatility is a kind of one of the key challenges, especially for petroleum-based fuels. But other fuels can be less volatile, and you don't have to kind of worry about that. But it is something that when you kind of do kind of cost analysis, it's something to be aware of, that just because the price today is $3.33 doesn't mean it's going to be that over the lifetime of your vehicle. And so kind of using some upper lower bounds to kind of, if you're doing that type of analysis, can be really important to like help you understand like the sensitivity, because like a lot of factors whenever you're doing emissions analysis or cost analysis rely on some assumptions, and you don't have perfect information for the future, especially obviously. So kind of bounding that is a way to be able to better interpret like kind of the outputs of a tool like this. Another space that we spend a lot of time on is kind of the cost. Like when we think about cost of vehicle, we think about like the purchase price of the vehicle and then maybe fuel costs. Like those are kind of the two ones that people generally think about. But we've done some studies on the other costs that are maybe less studied on the research side and less kind of available maybe in the public literature and the public mind, but maybe for fleet managers are really important. And people like who run a fleet like know these costs really well, but maybe for, again, the general public, or even the comparison of like, well, I know my fleet and I know my say diesel school buses, this is how they're doing. The older ones are doing this, the new ones are doing that. And then I got some new propane ones and like they're doing this. But we tried to be able to like represent like what costs may be, for these different powertrains, kind of digging in. And while this was a research report and we were trying to, while we have like this chart of like, here's, our output of like something, it wasn't really meant to be like, this is the answer, that this is like an area that we don't have great data on, and we're trying to like push the field a little bit better. Because, maintenance costs, like let's say for EVs, there's questions about that, is that like, well, this is meant to be like kind of your scheduled maintenance and like kind of the preventative type of things that you have to do. And so for light duty, we have a pretty good sense of that, but things like unscheduled maintenance, repairs are a challenge, and the data is not as good there. And we've heard, the cost of repairing maybe certain EVs can be expensive, and oftentimes it's like, maybe it's like the infotainment system glitches out, and like it's hard to like generalize that data to kind of like, EVs give you this, gasoline gives you that. But we tried to like cover that as best we could. But yeah, that's in the tool. And so like you can tweak that, and you could say, well, I'm paying, let's say, 20 cents per mile for maintenance. And our tool says, well, it's, for an EV, it's going to be about 40% lower. You can say, well, I'm not sure about that. I want to like tweak it. I want to be more conservative and say, I'm going to say it's going to be the same, and be more conservative and say, well, maybe I'll run another scenario where we're getting some benefits, and, kind of do some bounding there. Same thing for insurance. Depreciation is really important. I could go on and on about kind of this, but I'll stop. So the new features, and then I'll kind of quickly I'll buzz through these because I want to go through like the tool and then like leave some time just to like chat. Um, let's see. It's a time check. What time is it?
So we're at
1:30?
2:30 and
2:30.
or I'm
Okay.
sorry, 2:30 Eastern time, Andy. Sorry about
Yep.
that. Yeah.
Central. Yep. So yeah, so the online tool, I think this is like a big thing that again, for people to like feel more comfortable using the tool, we've kind of redesigned the tool, added more calculators, and we've been really focusing on like getting the spreadsheet versions of our tools here so that people can walk through this a little bit easier. I have like a demo in the slide deck, and I can actually just open the tool later, but and I'm happy to share the slides after as well for you to look
Thank
at
you,
them.
Andy.
But basically, we try to keep the key inputs, up front. If you want to dig in, you'll see kind of tabs up in the top left corner: fuel prices, other costs, some of the fuel options you can go and tweak. But it's meant to be able to change the assumption and then see the results right away. And then there's a way to export these results so that, like, if you were wanting to share this with a colleague or someone you're working with, to say, here are my assumptions. It gives you the inputs, here are the outputs, and you can kind of work from there. So the other big thing that we released this year was the EV utility rate calculator. I mentioned this in passing, but like the real kind of challenge for charging vehicles, especially as we start thinking about larger commercial vehicles with higher power charging, is that if you face demand charges, and there's time of use aspects of those demand charges, or not, like the demand charges can be quite significant, as you have multiple vehicles charging potentially at the same time. So we're using a public data source on rates, and so there's always still some challenges of that because there are so many utilities and there are so many rates, and rates can kind of come up, especially like EV rates start to like show up, kind of here and there. But we're trying to like, for the spreadsheet, we picked a certain amount of large utilities, and then a certain amount of like rates within those utilities to best represent them. And we might not cover every utility. And we allow like some customization, so you can kind of make your own custom rate. It gets a little bit tricky as you start to think about like, well, the hour by hour thing gets a little challenging, and oftentimes there's like a summer season and a winter season, so you have to kind of work on it. But that's why we wanted to especially get this one online so that we could access this full database of all the rates and then potentially keep it more up to date. We're still working on how we're going to do that. But the idea is basically you enter some information about your vehicles that you're going to charge, and then some of the charging scenarios of like, how powerful is the charging? What time periods are you charging? And then you get kind of a breakdown of the costs of doing that, your demand charges, your energy charges, your fixed charges. And then I mentioned that, kind of that's one piece of the cost, but the other piece is really the purchasing of equipment, installing the equipment. So there's a separate calculator that also includes some, rate calculations too, but basically helps you get kind of a full, like levelized, we call it like a levelized cost of charging, or a total cost. Like NPV is like net present value, like a total cost of charging. And it includes factors like utilization, the capital costs, annual operating costs like communications, warranty, maintenance, electric costs using the previous calculator I just mentioned. This is going to be online, and I think it'll be, because there's a lot of pieces to this. Like I think it'll be especially handy online, but the Excel version is in the tool. So if you have like a chance to get into it and you have questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. And then the last thing that I'll go through is the charging CFI calculator, charging and fueling infrastructure calculator. We developed that standalone tool that I showed you earlier with basically the Joint Office of Transportation and Energy because of the FHWA grants. But then we also rolled it into AFLEET so that we could cover more fuels than what that grant was focusing on. So basically the biofuels. And I mentioned, and when I walk through that, kind of like how the calculation's done, we're using utilization. We're trying to make some assumption of like what kind of vehicles are charging or using the fuel, whether it's light duty or heavy duty or some mix. And then we can tweak, are you getting RNG or are you not? What's the grid mix to do these emissions calculations? So now I can pause because I know I've been talking a lot long, and see if there's any questions before I kind of demo the tools.
Very cool. Thank you, Andy. Yes, I was going to say, does anyone have any questions for Andy right now, going over any of the tools? That way, before he actually gets into the AFLEET. Please, like I said, feel free to unmute yourself. Like I said, this is a safe space, so I want everyone to, if you have questions, we'll also have questions at the end as well, but since Andy, give him a little break from talking. So, and Rita, did you have a question? Did you want to ask?
I wanted to say one thing. Andrew has always been so helpful whenever I had a question about some nook and cranny of this gigantic spreadsheet. I mean, Andy, you've been great. I can't thank you enough. I use it a lot, in my consulting work. I wanted to make the point, and Andrew had to help me with this in 2023. There's an EPA calculator that's kind of more used for buildings, but a lot of engineers, use that, and it calculates CO2 equivalents. And what I had to ask Andy was, how does because I don't like that calculator. I've never been able to get it to work for me with vehicles, and it's like a massive amount of inputs and stuff. And I had to ask him, how does the output of the AFLEET in terms of GHGs compare with the CO2 equivalent output of the EPA tool? And he very kindly answered that for
I was
me.
going to say, yeah, Andy, please. I'm going to give my opinion. I think this tool's better, but Andy, please feel free to go ahead and no, please feel free, Andy, go right ahead and share your response.
Yeah, thanks, Ria. And I think that's one of the resources that we try to provide, not just like the tools, but like some information behind the tools. So, Alicia, Alex, have experience with AFLEET, and they may or may not be able to answer like some question, but they're a resource. Kind of for those folks, we have a technical services that answers questions for kind of our clean cities folks as well. But then I'm here too as a resource to answer questions and on kind of the EPA versus our tools. I think one of the things is always what are you trying to accomplish, for a tool, and it can even AFLEET, you garbage in, garbage out. If you change all the results to be all the inputs to be really unrealistic, the output's going to be unrealistic. And making something user friendly, we've spent a lot of time trying to do that as well. So I guess to your specific question on greenhouse gas emissions, that's one of the things, as people are trying to start to get, if you're not someone who does sustainability or does a lot of emissions, just even getting a sense okay, what's greenhouse gas emissions, and what are air pollutant emissions, how do they overlap, what's included when you include this or that. And so those types of things, we've in the past, I've given some presentations, but if you have questions about that, again, I'm a resource, other people are a resource to help. But I know I'm rambling. So greenhouse gas emissions include CO2, which is carbon dioxide. Like that's the thing that most people, when people kind of talk about greenhouse gas emissions, they talk about carbon emissions. So that's like the key one that like we focus on. In transportation, there's two other ones. Methane can be important, especially when we think of like natural gas vehicles, which are basically running, that is basically methane they're running on. And if it is venting from either the station or upstream when you're producing the fuel, or even the vehicle, like if you don't combust all the methane and it's slipping, it's called combustion slip, it goes out the tailpipe, that can be an important factor. And then there's one other one that is not super important. It's called nitrous oxide, or N2O. But anyway, so people like, yeah, it can be confusing, and like what are we talking about? So in AFLEET, we take all three of those greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and basically use what's called global warming potential to combine them into one metric, which is we use greenhouse gas emissions, grams per month, grams or tons of output. We use tons, I'm sorry, but yeah. And then other tools might say CO2e. And so it's the same thing, CO2e, the E is equivalent. It's just a way of just combining them together. So yeah, I know that was a long rambling response to that question. Any other questions?
I was going to say you were muted.
It was
Leah.
so, yeah, I thought I hit it, but it was so confusing to figure that out. And I work with all these building engineers who are really smart and really good at this stuff. And to find the answer to that question, took on my part a massive, massive amount of investigation, because the EPA does not really, their tools are not user friendly, and they don't download well. And then you download it, it doesn't work. You get all these error messages. So, if they would just put something on their website, it would be like, okay, there's the answer. But meanwhile, you have to look at like 10 or 12 different things and IPCC reports and stuff. So, it works well. And I think it's like you said, the best thing to use.
So yeah, I think beyond, the tool, again, like reaching out so that you don't get stuck and feel like kind of lost and stuff is an important, thing that, reaching out to somebody who can help, and finding whether it's, the coalitions you're working with, like they wear many hats, and like they may or may not be able to answer the question, but they may know, like, hey, Andy might know, and let me check with Andy about that, and can like, connect the dots. So I think that's kind of, how often these things happen. I forget, we have probably half hour still scheduled, but is there any other questions? And I don't want to cut off questions. I think Q&A can be really valuable.
I agree. I was going to say, I don't think we have any yet. Andy, if you want to, I guess, go into the next portion. But I was going to say, yes, if anybody has any questions, like I said, please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to put it in the chat because you don't want to unmute yourself, please feel free. And I'll ask those questions of Andy as well.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. So I think I'm going to start on the online tool because it's a little easier to digest, and then can go to the spreadsheet and maybe quickly like see how it relates, and see that, depending on what you do, like it can be not so bad, but it just takes a little bit of time of like getting a sense of like what inputs you need to put in to get the output that you want. So here's our home page. Like you can get to the spreadsheet here, and I can click on it. And here we're kind of under the Greet team page, and like you have to sign in. Like if you haven't signed in for a while, which click the wrong thing, of course. If you haven't signed in to download the spreadsheet, which I haven't done, or if you clear your cookies, you'll have to use your email that if you had already signed in. But if you're a new user, you have to punch in some of this information. There is also a user guide, a little bit of history of the vehicle and so forth. And then we also have like all the old versions in there too. The online tool, which I will spend time on, I mentioned HDVAC, A-Travels here, AFLEET CFI. So kind of you can get to your, calculator or tool like here. So the AFLEET Online, it has its own homepage. The 3 calculators that are here, we're adding new ones kind of each year. Well, I'm going to kind of do the payback on road just quickly. The approach, I zoom in, so let me zoom out a little bit. The approach is that I mentioned that we have like these different powertrain fuel technologies, and you can enter kind of that information or use our default. So the first, I'll just kind of start, like you would choose your vehicle type. So let's say we want to focus on school buses. We typically, especially in the spreadsheet, we break out our light duty calculations and heavy duty. So you could do them at the same time. Here, you just kind of do one at a time. You pick your state, and the state matters for a couple, like your default fuel prices will be based on your state. The emissions for certain like tailpipe emissions will be based on your state, and I mentioned grid mix. As you change the variables, you see like a little bit of a flash, and so that is like the calculator is updating as you enter information. As like an engineer or whatever, or a government employee, like we're really good at acronyms, and some of these you may be like, well, what does this stand for? I don't know what this HHV stands for. So if you mouse over it, it'll give you like the full name. And you can see we have some other mouse overs that kind of explain stuff on here if you're confused about like what it is. There's also like if you make you change a default value and be like, well, what was the default? I want to go back to that one. You can click this reset button and it'll go back to like the number that you chose before, but we'll stick with changing the number. By default, like the heavy duty vehicles, the diesel one is already selected. And then if we go and switch to light duty, the gasoline would be the baseline. So that we're comparing to something in this simple payback calculation. Here, let's choose like EV, B20, and propane. So as you select those options, like results show up, it's based on these default values and some of the other things that we have here. So you would go and tweak them if you had better data. So say you had a grant that was, you're not going to pay $300K for the electric school bus, but you're going to pay, $150K, let's just say, that's going to change your output there. You may or may not have better fuel economy. That's one that's harder. So definitely fuel price is an important one. Maintenance, we see a potential significant savings. You'd be like, well, the folks I'm talking to, they're paying about the same for maintenance. So I'm going to change my assumption, be a little less, be more conservative, I guess. Same thing for each of these, doing this type of changing of this basically table of information. The next thing would be to go to fuel prices and say, well, here are some very specific prices. I want to like look at some scenarios. I want to look at $4 per gallon diesel, electricity. We got a good price, and we know we're going to be able to get like 5 cents per kilowatt hour. The biodiesel, we have a contract, we're getting 375, so on and so forth. And you can go and, estimate differences. The thing you see here with doing a payback analysis is that it doesn't work well for like drop-in fuels where the vehicle costs the same thing, because there's no incremental price. Like this is the same price. So you're not able to really represent how well economically the payback does with this type of calculation. So that's why the TCO might be a better choice. So can show that real quick after that, but just be mindful of that. And there'll be sometimes little notes of like, say the payback is going to be a really long time. So these are, you know, within the bounds of a vehicle lifetime. In this example, the propane's 2 years, very quick. The EV is 10 years. But let's say we go back to like 300,000, like the payback of like the fuel savings, and then here we have no maintenance savings. It's going to take longer than 30 years. So basically longer than any conceivable lifetime of a vehicle. You know, we don't make the chart go to like 700 years. If it says 700 years, we just say it's just not going to be able to make that payback. The other metrics that that we think about, talked about, greenhouse gas emissions. So this is that CO2e, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, aggregated into one value. We go from low to high by default. You could, you know, change everything to be alphabetical, do a little bit of high to low, whatever for these charts. But that's how it's sorted. So you may see kind of the slightly different order as you go from table to table. Petroleum use, same type of bar chart. The pollutant, air pollutant chart is kind of complicated. It's hard to do like this many pollutants in one chart. And then CO also has like the scale is different, so it's a funky chart. But if you're interested in, say, just NOx and PM, you can like click on the ones you're not interested in, and it makes it a little bit more digestible. But oftentimes it's just easier to look at this when you export this to the spreadsheet, which I will do that. I think, let's see, I'm not sharing. I think I'm just sharing my
No, we just
my-
see your screen like opening up the Excel spreadsheet, Andy. And then just real
Yeah.
quick before you go continue, I just wanted to say we may go over a few minutes past 2 or past 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to let you guys know so that way you guys can stay on for an additional about 10-15 minutes if that's okay. Thank you, Andy, again.
Yeah, and I can start to wrap up. So basically you can export
No
it. The output is going to be, you know, basically it's going to show you the inputs that you chose, the outputs that you chose in tables. So that's there. I won't spend too much time on payback off-road. Very similar structure. It's the payback calculator. You do the same things. There is like one extra tab of the EV battery info. Yeah. If you do something like I just did, like, oh, I went back to the calculator, the data that you entered is still there. You can save and load these things. So like if you wanted to come back to this and save this as Southeast Florida, run or something like that, save it, and then you come back to you can go and load, the Southeast Florida run, or delete it and stuff like that, all in your cookies. So if you delete your cookies all the time, it's going to be gone. Last thing I will show is the fuel options. So these things impact your emissions. So where is the biodiesel coming from? You might be using used cooking oil, and you kind of see, that was 16.6 there. I go there, 17.1. So it changes as you make different assumptions about where the fuel is from. You use a renewable version of propane, soy-based, it's going to change the footprint. Same thing. So grid mix, like this is an important thing to be aware of. Like the way we do this is like we use regional grid numbers. We don't do states. Florida's kind of its own thing. So for the most part, except for the
Of course.
panhandle. Yeah, right. But like you can use what we have by default, or you can go and say, well, I know that our fleet has a deal with the utility, and we want to like specifically, put that information in, and we want to say, well, we're, zero natural gas, zero coal, it's all, zeroing out, and it's all renewable. Like then obviously the results are, that one's kind of straightforward. It's zero, but like say it's 50% renewable and 50% natural gas. Like you can go and type that in. One last kind of important thing, because this gets a little bit into the technical weeds of like, well, what's this what is this system boundary, as we would say kind of in the research term, like what are you drawing your lines around for these emissions? For greenhouse gas emissions, we always think about not just the tailpipe, but producing the fuel, because greenhouse gas emissions are a climate, it's a climate related pollution. So basically it doesn't matter if the emissions are happening in South America, North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, right? It just matters that they're happening. The geography doesn't matter. But air pollution has human health impacts. And so if air pollution's happening, say in the desert, and there's not a lot of impact to like human populations, like that impact is different than if you're kind of in a crowded city and you have tailpipe emissions coming out from your school buses. So by default, there's three options, and we have some explanation of what they mean, but like we look at kind of that well to wheel, that looking at the fuel and the vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, and then the ampersand is kind of important here, and vehicle operation air pollutants. So vehicle operation means tailpipe. We don't say tailpipe because like you can have tire and brake wear. So EVs are not literally zero emissions. They do have tire and brake emissions. But so we try to be technically correct, but that can be confusing. So that's what by default the emissions are. If you want to include, say, the power plant emissions for air pollutant emissions, you would have to choose option 2. And then we see well to wheel, petroleum use, greenhouse gas, and what's that, the Oxford comma, basically, then you get all the air pollutant emissions of producing the fuel for not just electricity, but for diesel. So like drilling diesel. And so there is, again, challenges of the regionality of that, but like that's one thing to be cognizant of. And then the last is if you want to include like producing the vehicle, if you have those questions and people say, hey, what about, again, the battery? You can choose this option, and it will include the emissions to produce the vehicle as well. The battery's included in the vehicle. So that's that calculator. I'll stop kind of the online. The TCO is the same type of calculator as I mentioned. If you click all the powertrains, like this is a better, if you're doing stuff with like biofuels or things where the purchase price might actually be the same or could be even lower, like this will give you a better representation of like the full cost of that. So, and you could, again, tweak a little bit more details. The maintenance is there. The other costs really are the insurance, license and registration. Are you taking any loans for financing and so forth? So
Andy,
yeah.
we do have one question. Someone asked if you can explain what the diesel in use multiplier is.
Yep. So that's in all the calculators. That is a calculation that is somewhat legacy. So the EPA MOVES model had a problem analyzing new diesel emissions. So meaning model year 2010 and newer, they were drastically undercounting the NOx emissions, so one of the air pollutants for those vehicles. They fixed that emission. They fixed that in their most recent modeling. So we still have it there just in case they kind of, something is needed. There is still some problems with their light duty diesel numbers. So we actually, like, you could do this and like your heavy duty numbers are, it's hard to see, but like your heavy duty NOx isn't going to really change at all. But if you had like light duty, this will actually have just a slight, you see there is a little bit of change in the like something changes basically, because when we do that, and so the NOx actually should be a little bit higher. That's quite technical. Since light duty diesel isn't like so important, it's not a focus. And so we try to have as many mouse overs that explain stuff. I think in this online tool we don't have that mouse over, but like here in the spreadsheet, like you get to that thing, you can read about like all my notes about the diesel in use multiplier and kind of explains what it is. I know we have maybe 10, 15 minutes and people may drop, but that I think hopefully gives you a good sense of like what the online tools do, and like that they're relatively, you know, straightforward to step through. It's just getting your own data as best you can to like put them in there. And then if you want to get into like these Excel based tools, like we have a lot more here. And so you're able to answer maybe more questions, but it just takes a little bit of like knowing where to go. So the intro page, you know, probably like you like me, I like, oh, I skipped the intro page and just kind of like go and dig in. But like it's still kind of valuable to say, like, for each of these calculators, it says, you know, enter the key inputs in this input sheet, this blah, 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 then enter fuel prices here, adjust this, enter, you know, a secondary assumption, blah, blah, blah. So that is helpful, I think, as like a quick reference guide to say, like, this is what I need to enter for each of these. You know, it goes to eight different calculators. And the reason is because, you know, some of the input, like we have one main input sheet, and some of the inputs are used for multiple different calculators. So like the vehicle location is used multiple places. And some of this like light duty vehicle information that is very similar to the online tool. You know, the other tool lets you like select a vehicle, but here you can choose like a number, but it's the same thing: the mileage, the fuel economy, the purchase price, the maintenance. So you'll see kind of that very similar structure, drop downs there. There is like other kind of hidden features, which don't need to get into all that, but like, and if you have some questions, but like here, you know, the car, like you could click this, it's a hyperlink, and it's going to send you here. And so we have like all the data in this background data table of like all of our assumptions, and some things like a car, you know, like, is there a different price for a car or a taxi or a police car? We basically assume it's the same. That's not always the case in the real world, but like some of these assumptions, like a single unit short haul truck is like a very generic name for a vehicle. And it matters whether it's a step van, a dump truck, a fire truck, all those things could fall under that. And like their costs would differ. Anyway, so that's why, you know, like the spreadsheet can be a bit overwhelming, just because there's just more stuff, and like all the things that the online kind of hides in the background are kind of available to look at if you wanted to. So I kind of zooming out, like, so like some of the default stuff's over here, but it's basically like if you were doing a payback analysis, you would, you know, select the, you know, same thing, you would enter the number of vehicles that you're interested in. And, you know, sometimes that's all you really need is that assumption. But if you want to do it better, you kind of go and change the fuel price, whether it's a public or private station. And then you can go to the output and see these tables that give you the data. And because it's a spreadsheet, like everything shows, so it's a little harder to maybe digest when you're looking at my screen right now, but you could kind of take this stuff, copy it, delete the other columns, go look at the charts. And, you know, if you're good at dealing with the charts, you can go and fix this stuff, like some of the filter buttons and stuff like that. You can just pick like some of the ones that do show up, and you get a better looking chart or whatever. So those are like little things, like as you know, if you're Excel friendly or if you're Excel, an Excel person or not, like you can get into a bit more of the stuff because it's all here. And then like all the nitty gritty calculations are in like this sheet. So like we have the structure typically is you put your major inputs in this one input sheet for most, if not most, not all the calculators, but almost all of them. There's an actual calculator that does all the hard work, and it's real long and detailed and has a lot of the information. And I know this is painful watching someone scroll a spreadsheet, but like everything is in here. So if you wanted to dig into this, like you could. But then if you just like, well, I just want to get to the outputs, you know, you go to the sheet that says output, output, you know, some of them do that, but and again, this thing explains like, you know, view results on this sheet, payback off-road, right? So that's kind of the structure of what it is. Some of the things you see like in online are very similar. It's just that they hide, you know, we hide the things if you don't choose CNG, like we don't show you those assumptions. This thing is very similar to what we were just talking about, the diesel in use multiplier. There are additional notes, you know, that explain, you know, what this is about. So if you want to like dig into that, maybe the challenge of like the calculator, that it got bigger, like we added like, here's the idle reduction calculator inputs, they're here. So there's like a section for that. And then there's like, well, I got to scroll down for the charging and fueling infrastructure inputs. There's assumptions for that. And like, they're all kind of here, and you have to go to the right, you know, tool. So the assumptions for this calculator are going to result, you have to scroll over and go to CFI output and stuff like that. So I know that's quick and like maybe a little bit too quick, but like I do have in the deck that I'll share is I have like walkthroughs of the online, and then I also have some walkthroughs of the spreadsheet here, so that you can kind of see like how like I use the tool to enter the info. And if there's anything like missing there, or if you have any questions now, like feel free to like ping me, because I have other like decks that say like, this is how you walk through this calculator or something like that. So hopefully that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much, Andy. I wanted to see real quick, I know we're, like I said, 7 minutes over, but I wanted to see if anybody had any questions before we adjourn.
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this with us. Unless I am interpreting this all entirely wrong, this is a tool that's really used like vehicle by vehicle in like purchasing decision making. Like it's not for analyzing an entire fleet.
Yeah, it's more kind of, you can group things, like say you're going to replace 10 school buses, you know, at a shot. But right, it is meant to be like not saying I want to, if I have like a heterogeneous fleet of like, you know, 50 police cars, 50 fire trucks, 50 this, 50 that, 50 that, like, and I want to like replace all of them at once, like, or over a time period, like it doesn't let you do that type of analysis. Like you kind of have to go more piecemeal and focus in on specific equipment, because like the assumptions matter, like how many miles it drives and stuff like that. We have some footprinting capabilities for that, like to say your existing fleet, which is heterogeneous, like you can enter that info. And I think, you know, we haven't done this yet, but like I'm thinking of adding some of the cost information to help do a little bit of cost of ownership of that, but not like replacing everything.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
yeah, yep.
Hey, Andy, quick question. You mentioned the different things that go into the total cost of ownership. Just out of curiosity, for the EVs, is battery recycling included into that total cost of ownership?
That's a really good question. Yeah, the battery recycling is not. We don't have any kind of end use disposal. One of the things that like is kind of a big gap that we have, even just in general, is like battery replacement. Light duty, you know, we spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out, like, because we're getting to that point of the initial generation of EVs are now, you know, 14 or so years old. We're trying to figure out what battery life is. So light duty, the expectation is that in general, like with the warranties and the lifetime, that we expect them to be lasting the life of the vehicle, and maybe for certain fleet operations like that won't be the case. But for medium and heavy duty, there is obviously a greater expectation that battery replacement may happen. Even some of the like leasing terms are kind of talking about like a mid-year replacement of the batteries. So we don't have good data on that at this point. And it's something that we're trying to like figure out how to put that in there without kind of, without good data. Like, what do we do? I think that's kind of the challenge. So yeah, that's a very good question.
Can I have another one, a real quick one as well? You mentioned that the default parameters for the heavy duty vehicles in AFLEET is diesel and gasoline for light duty. I'm just wondering, is it an easy way in the tool itself to change the default parameter? Like, for example, if somebody wants to compare CNG to EVs. So if you currently run a CNG fleet and you want to consider what's going to be the impact of changing to EVs, can you make CNG a default so it's going to be easily compared?
So that's where like maybe the simple payback, it's not easy to be like, I want to compare this or that, just kind of like technically, like the calculations in Excel, that would be really hard for us to do. But kind of where a TCO might work there too is that like you could say the cost of ownership of the CNG and the EV are this and that. Like you can do that comparison a little bit more straightforward. Or in the payback, you like in the actual like spreadsheet, you can get the information of like, well, the kind of cost of the vehicle is this, the annual operating cost of that, and do like comparisons of like the actual cost components that drive the differences. It's a little bit more manual, so that's why I'd say the TCO is a little bit better for that.
Hey, Andy, thanks for hosting this walkthrough, and apologies for joining a little late. I was kind of wondering, on that battery question that Alex had on inputs, is there also the input availability for battery size based on kilowatt hour, and how that might play into environmental impacts or maintenance costs down the road with the life of the vehicle?
Yeah, so we do have, it's kind of hidden a bit, the assumptions along kind of the battery manufacturing costs. So we have some assumptions of how big the battery is going to be, and obviously that's something that as a customer, you can choose like, yeah, I want, well, in some cases, or like you choose a different vehicle that has more range, right? So it isn't out in front to do that. And then we don't have that kind of on the maintenance. Like we don't have good data to say like, well, I mean, the replacement cost is kind of the key thing, I guess, that would come there. But like, so that isn't something that is like real upfront that you can change. You would think about it more like the way I would think about it is kind of that upfront price that obviously, like, let's say the 100-mile range school bus is 200,000, and then the 200-mile one is 200,000 or something like that. You can deal with that, and then like if you had some assumption for battery replacement, you kind of like basically have to kind of manually think it through there, and then yeah. So it's a good question. I think it's something that we're very cognizant of and like want to like put something better there. It's just finding that data has been really, really, really hard.
Agreed. Well, appreciate the efforts, and yeah, I think as more clarity is provided in that environment, it's helpful for us on the fleet procurement, as well as just understanding our own vehicles as they operate to better understand that number. So appreciate the efforts.
Yep.
And with that, I wanted to see, does anyone else have any additional questions? Because I know we're at 3:14, so I was going to try to get everyone out of here by 3:15. But I just wanted to make sure if any of our stakeholders had any additional questions before we adjourn and Andy goes back. All right. And with that, silence is golden. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time out today for the training. Thank you so much, Andy, for conducting the training. I will share the slides with everyone after the training. And then just to let you guys know, It will also be on our website. I'm going to post it to our YouTube channel, and then Alex in Tampa Bay Clean Cities will also have access to the recording and post it for his stakeholders as well. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Andy. This was awesome. I look forward to, fielding any additional questions. And like I said, please feel free to reach out to me or Alex if you guys need anything on behalf of us from Clean Cities. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.